The midday sun blazed relentlessly over the Arizona desert, painting the landscape with an unforgiving heat. The earth beneath Jasper Wild's boots was cracked and dry, and the sparse cactus and thorny shrubs provided little shade from the blistering rays. His horse, dusted with sweat and covered in grime from the long ride, moved with a steady, measured pace. Jasper had been tracking his missing cattle for 3 hours through this barren wasteland, but the cattle were the last thing on his mind when he heard it. A sound, weak, desperate, and utterly out of place in the endless sea of dust and stone. It was a cry, a faint, broken wail that cut through the silence of the desert like a knife. Jasper pulled his reins tight, his heart skipping a beat. It was human, someone in pain, a cry for help. For a moment, the old instincts kicked in. He thought about turning back, the weight of his past hanging on his shoulders like a shadow, always reminding him to avoid trouble. But the sound came again, this time even weaker, carried on the hot desert wind. There was no ignoring it. With a quiet curse, Jasper spurred his horse forward. His boots crunched over the dry earth as he pushed through the endless stretch of desert, following the echo of the cry that called out in the vast emptiness. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, the harsh sun casting long, jagged shadows across the red sand. As he crested a small rise in the land, the sight below him made him question his sanity. There, in the middle of nowhere, stood a crude iron cage, barely large enough for a person to stand in. The bars were scorched by the sun, the metal glinting in the heat. Inside, slumped against the bars, was a young woman. Her dress was torn, faded, and stained with dust and blood. Her dark hair clung to her face in matted, grimy strands. She was nothing but a shadow of herself, a ghost of a girl caught in a world that had forgotten her. Jasper's heart tightened. He had seen cruelty before, had even been a part of it in his past, when a world had felt more like a battlefield than a place to live. But this was something else. Who would do this? Who would leave a girl to die in the desert heat, locked away in a cage like an animal? The girl lifted her head as a shadow fell across her, her eyes flickering with a mix of fear and disbelief. She tried to speak, but the words came out as nothing more than a hoarse croak. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her face burned by the relentless sun. Jasper dismounted slowly, his mind racing. He wasn't the kind of man who took risks anymore. Not after everything. But something about this girl, something about her helplessness, her suffering, pulled at him in a way that he couldn't ignore. He moved toward the cage, the sound of his boots crunching on the sand like thunder in the empty desert. The girl's eyes followed his every movement. Hope flickered in her gaze, like a candle fighting against the wind. "Shoo!" Jasper murmured softly as he approached. "I'm going to get you out of here." He reached down and pulled his water flask from his belt. She flinched at first, but when he offered it to her, her trembling hands grasped it with desperation. The water was cool against her parched lips, and Jasper watched the relief spread across her face, even as the reality of the situation settled like a weight in his chest. As the last drops of water disappeared, he examined the lock on the cage. It was heavy, rusted, but sturdy. A simple padlock. Whoever had done this had made sure she couldn't escape, and they had made sure no one would come to her aid. Jasper's eyes scanned the ground around them. Boot prints in the sand, horse tracks, recent ones. Whoever had left her here couldn't be far away. A sound broke through his thoughts. Hoofbeats, distant but growing closer. Jasper's hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 on his hip, but he hesitated. These weren't random drifters or cattle rustlers. These men rode with purpose. They weren't lost. The girl's wide eyes met his, terror flooding her face as she pressed herself against the bars of the cage, her body shrinking as if she could disappear into the metal. Jasper's mind raced as the sound of horses grew louder. There was no time left. The dust cloud swirled like a storm on the horizon, and soon the riders appeared. 3 of them, their figures emerging like ghosts from a heat mirage. They came at full speed, their horses kicking up the dry earth with every stride, and Jasper knew instinctively that they weren't coming to help. They weren't just any men. These were the kind of men who made the land tremble when they rode. Their posture was stiff, purposeful, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The lead rider was a massive man, his black beard and cold eyes betraying a cruelty that made the hairs on Jasper's neck stand up. He slowed his horse as they drew near, his companions following suit, their hands resting on their gun belts like they were already preparing for a confrontation. The ground seemed to tremble under the weight of their horses, and the air felt thick with the promise of violence. Well, the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the desert silence, the words dripping with mockery. "Looks like someone found our little lost lamb." Jasper's jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral, sizing them up. 3 against 1, and they had the high ground. His mind calculated distances and escape routes, but the truth was there was no easy way out. No matter how quick he was with his gun, he wasn't going to make it out of here without a fight. The man dismounted with surprising grace for his size, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. He stood tall, a predator in the vast emptiness of the desert. His companions, equally as imposing, fanned out behind him, waiting for any sign of movement. The man looked Jasper over like he was sizing up a piece of livestock. "Name's Cormar Mac Dullen," he said, his eyes locking onto Jasper's with an unsettling familiarity. "This here's my property you're trespassing on." Jasper's eyes flicked to the girl in the cage. Her face was drawn tight with fear, her body pressed as far as it could go into the bars. She was trembling, but she held herself upright with a defiance that cut through the terror in her eyes. "Property," Jasper growled, stepping forward. "This girl ain't property." Dullen laughed, a low, grinding sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "Oh, but she is. See, little Magnolia there owes me a considerable debt. Her daddy thought he could cheat at cards and walk away clean. When we came to collect, he'd already run off, leaving his daughter to pay what he owed." Jasper felt a knot tighten in his chest. The girl in the cage, Magnolia, shook her head violently, her voice cracking with desperation. "I told you I don't know where he went. I swear I don't." Dullen's face twisted into a cruel smile. "Of course you don't, sweetheart. But debt's still debt. And until Daddy shows his face, you're my guarantee he'll come back." Jasper felt something dark and familiar stir within him, a deep rage that had been buried for too long. The kind of rage that had gotten him into trouble before, the kind of rage that had cost him everything he once cared about. But looking at this girl, seeing the hopelessness in her eyes, something snapped. He couldn't just walk away. "How much does she owe?" Jasper asked, his voice hardening. Dullen's companions exchanged a quick glance before the wiry man with pale eyes spat in the sand. 500, Dullen said, his voice smooth. "Plus interest. Plus the cost of keeping her fed and watered out here." It was more money than most men saw in a year. Jasper's ranch barely brought in enough to keep him fed through the winter, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. He couldn't let this girl be left to die out here, alone, because of some mistake her father had made. "I'll pay it," Jasper said, his voice quiet, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Dullen's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "Well, now that's mighty generous of you, stranger. But see, there's another problem." Jasper's hand instinctively moved to his Colt 45, but he held himself steady. Dullen's tone had shifted, and it wasn't just because of the money. Jasper could feel the tension building, like the air before a thunderstorm. The other 2 riders, who had been silent up until now, were slowly circling him, moving into position. "What's the problem?" Jasper asked carefully, his mind calculating his next move. Dullen's hand rested casually on his gun belt, and the mocking grin never left his face. "You just witnessed something you weren't supposed to see." The threat in Dullen's voice was unmistakable, but Jasper had heard worse from better men. What made his blood run cold was the way the other 2 riders had positioned themselves, closing in on him like wolves circling prey. "I don't see nothing here but a man helping someone in need," Jasper said, trying to buy time, his voice low and calm. "Far as I'm concerned, I rode out here looking for cattle and found this girl near dead from thirst. Good Christian thing to do is help her." Dullen's laugh was short and humorless. Good Christian, huh? That what you call yourself, stranger? Jasper's skin crawled at the tone. He'd spent years trying to escape his past, trying to run from the man he used to be. But men like Dullen always had a way of sniffing out a violent past. What I call myself ain't your concern, Jasper replied, his voice flat. The money I offered is real. Take it and ride away. The wiry man, Pike, shifted in his saddle. Boss, maybe we should just shut up. Dullen's cold eyes never left Jasper. I'm trying to place you, friend. Something familiar about the way you carry yourself. The way you're standing like you ain't afraid of three-armed men. Jasper's heart skipped. He'd changed his name, stayed out of towns for years. But some things were harder to hide than others. He could feel the eyes of the men on him, the recognition creeping into the air like smoke. Inside the cage, Magnolia watched in silence, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and recognition. She seemed to understand that this moment between Jasper and the men, was going to decide her fate. Tell you what, Dullen continued, stepping closer with a slow, predatory smile. Why don't you state your name real clear? Like maybe that'll help my memory. The moment Jasper had been dreading was finally here. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't hide. Name's Wild, Jasper said, his voice steady despite the weight of his past crashing down on him. Jasper Wild. The effect was immediate. The third rider, who had been silent until now, straightened in his saddle. Holy hell, boss. Jasper Wild. The Jasper Wild. Dullen's eyes lit up with cruel recognition. Well, I'll be damned. The ghost of Tombstone himself. Thought you were dead, Wild. I am dead, Jasper said quietly. Been dead for 3 years. Not dead enough, Dullen smirked, his hand moving to his gun. The words hung in the air, a weight that seemed to pull the heat from the desert around them. Jasper Wild. The name had the power to silence men, to bring back memories of long-lost gunfights, of blood spilled in Tombstone's dusty streets. The stories had long since turned into legends, whispers of a man who had been the fastest, the deadliest, a gunfighter who disappeared as quickly as he had come. Jasper's heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He couldn't afford to let the past control him now, not with Magnolia's life hanging in the balance. Dullen's grin widened as he took a step closer, his heavy boots kicking up the red dust beneath him. His companions, Pike and the third man, watched with a mixture of fear and fascination, clearly recognizing the name, but unsure of how to handle the situation. The desert sun beat down relentlessly, but it felt like the temperature had dropped several degrees, the tension turning the air cold as ice. Jasper didn't flinch as Dullen's mocking laughter filled the air. Well, I'll be damned. The ghost of Tombstone himself. Thought you were dead, Wild. Guess I was wrong. I am dead, Jasper said quietly, his voice steady as the wind. Been dead for 3 years. The word hung between them like a promise or a curse. A ghost in the desert, haunting the men who had once feared him. Dullen's face twisted with something between amusement and a simmering rage. Not dead enough, Dullen sneered, his hand resting casually on the handle of his gun. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous light, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Jasper knew that Dullen saw him as nothing more than a target, a relic from a past that was ripe for the taking. The wind howled through the canyon, but inside the cage, Magnolia was watching with wide eyes, her breath quick and shallow. She had heard the stories, too. Stories of Jasper Wild and the infamous gunfight that had left him a shadow of a man who had disappeared and been left behind like so many of the old gunslingers. The silence stretched on as Dullen's hand hovered near his gun, his fingers twitching as though he couldn't decide whether to strike first or see if the ghost would shoot him down. The air between them crackled with danger, and Jasper could feel the weight of the decision in his gut. You're a hard man to forget, Dullen muttered, his smile fading into a scowl. But I've killed men faster than you, Wild. You've lost your edge. You've lost everything. And now you're just another fool who's wandered into the wrong part of the desert. Jasper's lips tightened into a grim line. The anger he had buried deep inside for years, surged like a wildfire. He had lived with the guilt of what happened to Sarah, had carried it in silence. But now the words, the name, the past, they all came rushing back. He could feel it, the pulse of violence that ran deep in his blood, the same pulse that had carried him through the gunfights in Tombstone, the same pulse that had seen him survive 100 dangerous encounters. And it was that pulse, that rage, that kept him from backing down now. He didn't care about what Dullen thought of him. He didn't care about his reputation or the fear his name might bring. All he cared about was the girl in the cage and the chance to do something, anything, to make things right. Jasper's hand moved slowly toward his Colt .45, fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle. His breath was steady, his focus razor-sharp. In the desert, the difference between life and death was as thin as the edge of a blade. And Jasper Wild had spent his life walking that edge. "You made a mistake, Dullen," Jasper said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of years of regret. "You brought on my sister. That was your mistake." The words hit Dullen like a slap, and for the first time, the smug look on his face faltered. "Sarah," Jasper said, the name hanging in the air like a ghost. "You think I'm scared of a man like you? You think I'm scared of dying, Dullen? I've died once already. I've seen what hell looks like, and it doesn't scare me anymore." Dullen's hand tightened on his gun. But before he could draw, Jasper's Colt was already in his hand, the barrel aimed squarely at the bearded man's chest. It was too fast for anyone to react. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the vastness of the desert, but it rang loud enough in their ears. Dullen stumbled back, his chest searing with pain as the bullet struck him dead center. He gasped, his body collapsing to the ground, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. Jasper didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the men in front of him, never wavering, never blinking. The gun was still warm in his hand, the echo of the shot still vibrating in the air. Pike, the wiry man who had been circling Jasper, reached for his own gun, but he was too slow. Jasper fired again, his aim true, the bullet tearing through the man's shoulder and sending him sprawling to the ground with a scream. The third man froze, his hand hovering over his gun, but he didn't move. "You're next," Jasper said coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Either drop your gun and walk away, or I'll send you to hell with him." The man hesitated for a long moment, eyes darting between Dullen's lifeless body and the gun in Jasper's hand. Finally, he made the wise choice, dropping his weapon to the sand. The third man backed away slowly, fear written all over his face. He turned and fled, disappearing into the desert. Jasper's eyes never left the man until he was out of sight. His heart was pounding, but the rage had subsided, replaced with a cold clarity. It was over. Behind him, Magnolia was still inside the cage, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock at the speed of the violence. But there was something else in her gaze now, something that hadn't been there before. A flicker of hope. Jasper approached the cage, his boots kicking up the red sand as he moved. His heart pounded as he reached for the key that had fallen to the ground. With a steady hand, he unlocked the cage, and the door swung open with a creak. Magnolia stumbled out into his arms, her legs too weak to hold her. For a moment, she said nothing, just clung to him like a lifeline. "Can you ride?" Jasper asked, his voice quiet but urgent. The sound of approaching horses was still fresh in his mind. She nodded, breathless. "Yes." "Then we're leaving now." The two of them, man and girl, fled across the desert like shadows in the heat. Jasper urged his horse forward, the pounding of hooves echoing across the empty expanse as they raced away from the chaos they'd just created. Magnolia clung to him, her grip tight and desperate, her breath shallow as she pressed her face into the back of his jacket. She didn't speak. There was no need for words. The world around them was wild and unforgiving, and they had only one chance to escape. The sound of the approaching horses, more of Dullen's men, or worse, still echoed in his mind. But for now, they were ahead, pushing forward with the wind at their backs. Jasper kept his eyes scanning the horizon, ever watchful for any sign of pursuit. He knew they wouldn't be safe until they were miles away, hidden from the men who had hunted Magnolia like cattle. But something gnawed at him as they rode, a feeling he couldn't shake. The distant sound of gunfire still lingered in the air behind them, but it was fading. The battle between the Federales and the U.S. Marshals had shifted directions, leaving the desert quiet once more. The silence felt heavier now, as though the world had shifted its balance, as though everything had changed in the span of a few heartbeats. "Thank you." Magnolia's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She spoke softly, her words wrapped in the dust and the wind, but there was an unmistakable weight to them. Jasper didn't respond right away. He couldn't. He wasn't sure how to respond to gratitude for something so simple as helping a girl out of the cage, something that had felt so inevitable. But he knew this was different. She wasn't just anyone. Magnolia wasn't a victim of some random chance, nor was she just some girl caught in a dangerous world. She had a father, a story, a past. Jasper's gaze was fixed ahead, but the memory of what she'd said earlier hung in his mind like a shadow. The mention of her father hiding in Devil's Canyon. Something about it rang true, but not in the way he had expected. There was something deeper to the story, something Magnolia had yet to tell him. "You've been running for a long time, haven't you?" Jasper asked, his voice low as they continued down the dusty trail. His horse's hooves kicked up red clouds, the air heavy with heat and exhaustion. Magnolia's hand tightened against his waist, and he could feel her flinch. Her voice came after a long pause, almost a whisper against the wind. "I've been running my whole life." Jasper didn't need to ask any further. The truth was there, written in the way she held herself, in the way she spoke, in the fear that still held her even as they rode toward freedom. Her father had left her behind, not by choice, but by necessity. She'd spent her life trying to outrun a past she hadn't chosen. They rode in silence for what seemed like hours, the desert stretching out around them in a vast, empty wasteland. The sun beat down, but the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain somewhere far in the distance. Jasper's eyes stayed on the horizon, scanning for any sign of movement. They hadn't ridden long enough yet to be safe. As they crested a small hill, the first dark shape on the horizon appeared. Jasper squinted, narrowing his eyes against the sun. More riders. But these were different. They weren't the men who had chased them from the cage. They were too organized, too precise in their movements. Jasper's hand slid back to the Colt at his side, his heart pounding as the realization hit him. "Marshals," he muttered under his breath. The riders weren't far now, and there was nowhere to hide. No cover except the open plains. The U.S. Marshals were coming, and they were coming fast. Magnolia must have felt the shift in the air too, because she leaned forward, her voice tight with fear. "What do we do?" Jasper's mind raced, his fingers curling around the gun handle. He couldn't outrun them, not with Magnolia on the horse behind him. He didn't want to fight, didn't want to be dragged back into the life he'd left behind. But the choice had been made for him the moment he stepped in to help her. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the moment. "We're going to keep riding." "But they'll catch us," she said, her voice breaking. "We can't outrun them forever." Jasper's eyes locked onto the approaching riders, and he felt the familiar knot of dread settle in his stomach. But there was a coldness to his thoughts now, a realization that for once there was no running. Not anymore. "They won't catch us," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "Not if we make it to Devil's Canyon first." The words came out before he could stop them, and as soon as he spoke, he knew there was no turning back. Devil's Canyon, the place where Magnolia's father had been hiding, the place where everything they had run from would finally catch up to them. "But how do you know about Devil's Canyon?" Magnolia asked, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Jasper didn't answer right away. The truth, the real reason he had brought her into this fight, was one he wasn't ready to tell. He had no intention of getting involved in anyone else's war, but that was what he had done. He had made the decision, and now he would see it through. "I've heard of it," he said finally, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "I know the way." It wasn't much of an explanation, but it was the best he could give. They were running out of time, and the sound of the approaching riders was growing louder. His heart raced as he urged his horse onward, the desert stretching endlessly in front of him. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of a canyon, a place where the earth had split wide open. Devil's Canyon, Magnolia's father, the gold. And then, without warning, the first shot rang out. The shot echoed across the barren desert, the sound sharp and brutal, slicing through the air like a warning. Jasper's horse jolted beneath him, and Magnolia's hand tightened around his waist. The wind carried the dust from the riders behind them, but they couldn't outrun the sound of the shot that had just been fired. Jasper cursed under his breath, kicking his heels into the side of the horse, urging it to go faster. His mind raced, calculating the distance, the timing. They weren't going to make it to Devil's Canyon before the marshals caught up with them. But he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. He glanced back briefly and saw the riders, a cloud of dust rising behind them. There were 4 of them, all armed, all closing the distance with every stride of their horses. They weren't giving up. They weren't just lawmen. They were hunters, and their prey had been elusive for far too long. "I don't want to die out here, Jasper," Magnolia said, her voice trembling. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps, and her face was pale with fear. She clung to him harder now, like she might be swept away by the wind if she let go. Jasper didn't answer at first. He could feel the heat of the sun on his back, the sting of sweat in his eyes. He needed a plan. The canyon was still miles away, and with the marshals on their trail, they were running out of time. His hand moved to his Colt, fingers brushing the worn handle. He knew what had to be done. There was no getting away now. No way out without bloodshed. "We'll make it," Jasper said, though he didn't believe it. He wasn't just lying to her. He was lying to himself, too. The truth was, they were cornered. The riders were closing in. They were within shooting distance now, and Jasper knew that any second the marshals would open fire. He could feel the weight of the moment, the slow march toward a confrontation that was going to define everything. Magnolia's fate, his fate, and the blood that would be spilled. Then, ahead of them, he saw the faint silhouette of a canyon ridge, jagged and unforgiving. Devil's Canyon. It was the only hope left. But Jasper knew that once they entered the canyon, there would be no turning back. It was a maze of rocks and narrow paths, perfect for an ambush. "Hold on tight," he muttered, his voice low as he steered the horse toward the canyon. Magnolia clung to him, her fingers digging into his coat. "What are we doing?" she asked, her voice thick with panic. "We're going in," Jasper said. "We don't have a choice." He didn't explain what he meant. Magnolia didn't need to know that the canyon held more than just an escape route. It held answers. Answers he wasn't ready to confront. Answers that had been buried long ago. The gunfire came then, the first shot cracking through the desert air, and Jasper's heart skipped. He heard the bullet whistle past his ear, and his hand instinctively reached for the revolver, pulling it free from its holster in one smooth motion. "Get ready," he warned, his voice cold hard. "It's about to get ugly." Magnolia's eyes were wide, fear and confusion clouding her expression. But there was something else in her gaze, something deeper. She had already made the choice to fight. She wasn't going to just sit there and let fate take her. The next shot rang out, but this time it didn't miss. The bullet struck the ground near their feet, kicking up a plume of dust. Jasper gritted his teeth, pulling the reins hard as he veered the horse into the jagged path of the canyon. The sound of hoofbeats thundered behind them, but he didn't look back. There was no time. They were in the canyon now, the walls closing in on them like the jaws of a trap. The terrain was rough, unforgiving, but it offered the only chance of survival. Ahead, the canyon split into narrow passages, each one winding deeper into the earth, leading toward the hidden places where no one would find them. But the sound of pursuing riders grew louder. The marshals were on their tail, and they weren't far behind. Jasper could hear their voices now, shouting commands, pushing their horses harder. They knew the canyon too. They had been here before. "Don't stop," Jasper yelled to Magnolia, spurring his horse into a gallop. His pulse was pounding in his ears, the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his veins. This was it. They were in the belly of the beast now, and there was no way out without a fight. The gunshots rang out again, this time closer, too close. Magnolia yelped in pain as a bullet grazed her arm. The sting of it sent a wave of panic through Jasper. But there was no time to check her wound. He had to keep going, had to keep her alive long enough to get them out. They reached the heart of the canyon, where the walls were steep and narrow. The only way out was a dangerous climb that Jasper had scouted once before. But the marshals were right behind them, their voices cutting through the canyon like the cry of vultures waiting for the kill. Jasper's eyes darted around. He could feel the pressure of time, the weight of the choices he had to make. Magnolia was injured. They weren't going to outrun them. "Get ready," he said again, his voice grim. "I'm going to make them regret chasing us." Jasper slowed the horse to a stop, his fingers trembling as he pulled his revolver from its holster. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Magnolia was still clinging to him, but she was starting to lose her grip. Her face was pale, her eyes clouded with fear. "I won't let them take you," he said fiercely. He had already made his decision. He had no intention of letting the law take her back to those men. Not after everything she had been through. Not after what he had seen in her eyes. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Jasper's heart began to race. They were almost there. But as the first of the marshals came into view, Jasper turned toward Magnolia, his face hardening with determination. "Hold on," he whispered, as he prepared to make the hardest decision of his life. Jasper Wild's heart beat louder than the sound of galloping hooves, louder than the shifting wind that howled through the narrow canyon. He gripped his revolver tightly, feeling the weight of it, the familiar cold metal, now a lifeline. He didn't look at Magnolia. She didn't need his reassurance. She had already made her choice. The marshals were closing in. He could hear the crunch of their boots on the rocks, their voices loud as they shouted commands to one another, the desperation in their tone unmistakable. They had cornered him, trapped him between the canyon walls. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He had made that promise to himself long ago, after everything he had lost. And now, Magnolia, this girl who had unknowingly dragged him back into the world he'd tried to escape, was going to be the reason he made his stand. The first marshal appeared, his figure framed by the jagged cliffs of the canyon. He was tall, his hand resting on his gun. Behind him, the others followed, their faces grim, their weapons ready. But they weren't prepared for the fire that burned in Jasper's chest. Not after everything he had been through, everything he had fought for. He had made his choices, and now there was no turning back. "Jasper Wild," the marshal called out, his voice deep and filled with authority. "It's over. You can't outrun us." Jasper didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just pulled the trigger. The first marshal's horse reared back, the bullet striking his chest. The man slumped forward, falling off his horse like a rag doll. The others drew their guns, but they weren't fast enough. Jasper fired again, his aim true, and the second man fell, his body hitting the rocks with a sickening thud. His heart raced as he turned to face the last two marshals, who now hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Magnolia's hand grasped his arm tightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You can do this," she whispered. Her words were soft, but they gave him strength, a reminder of why he had taken this stand. It wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever been forgotten in this unforgiving land. The two remaining marshals exchanged a glance. They weren't ready to die today. But there was something about the way Jasper held himself, the way his gun never wavered, that told them they had no choice but to back down. Slowly, they lowered their weapons, their faces a mix of fear and disbelief. Jasper's breathing steadied, and his mind cleared. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about redemption. It was about doing what was right, even when the world seemed bent on tearing everything down. The marshals, seeing the resolve in his eyes, backed away. They turned their horses, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, retreating down the canyon's winding paths, away from the ghost of Jasper Wild. When the last rider was out of sight, Jasper holstered his gun, his hand trembling slightly. The desert, the canyon, the harsh, unforgiving world around him. It all felt still, silent, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Magnolia stepped closer to him, her face soft, her eyes wide with gratitude and understanding. She had seen him fight, seen him choose the right thing, even when it seemed impossible. The girl who had once been locked away in a cage was now free, and so was he. The past, the regrets, the weight of the mistakes, all of it seemed to fade in the wind, carried away like dust across the desert. They didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing left to say. The sound of hooves fading into the distance was the only thing breaking the silence. The desert stretched out before them, endless and wild, but for the first time, it felt like home. Jasper looked down at Magnolia, his voice rough but sincere. "You're free now. They won't be able to hurt you again." She smiled, a small, fragile smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never thought I'd be free again." Jasper gave her a hard, steady look. "Some debts can only be paid by the living, Magnolia. And sometimes doing the right thing costs everything." With that, they turned their horses, heading deeper into the canyon, the path ahead uncertain. But at least now they were together. The sun was setting behind them, casting the canyon in a warm, golden light. In the desert, mercy rides slower than the wind. But justice, when it comes, has a way of catching up with you when you least expect it.